Okay, let's talk about the first of the three components, which is aperture. So when we are talking about an image and getting it properly exposed, we talk about three things that will affect that: the aperture, your ISO, and the shutter speed. I always choose to start with what I think is the most important out of the three, and that is aperture, because the aperture is going to have the biggest impact with the way the image will look in the final photo. So when I'm talking about aperture, the first and most important thing to know is that aperture is the size of the hole, and the size of the hole determines how much light hits the sensor. So remember in the earlier examples when I showed you the images that were overexposed and underexposed of the Hamilton Library? It is the size of the hole that is going to affect how much light gets into the camera, which is going to affect the image, which is going to affect if the image is properly exposed, overexposed, or underexposed. So here's what I think is best to explain aperture. If you look at the image on the left here, I want you to think of it as a lens, and that space in the middle would be the hole, and it being wide open. This would be an example of a wide open aperture. The image on the right, do you see the little hole? It looks tiny, like a little pinprick. It's only allowing a little bit of light to come through. That is another example. We have a big opening on the left where a lot of light is coming through, and we have a small opening on the right, and it's only allowing a small amount of light to come through. You might hear the term Fstop, and when you hear people discuss this, what they are discussing is the aperture. They really go hand in hand. Fstop is just really a numerical term. It's a part of the numerical system that describes how big a hole is or how small a hole is. So the diagram here is an example. So let's go ahead and take a look at the aperture or the different f-stops. If you look at the first one, you'll notice that the number is 1.4. And when the number is lower, the hole is actually bigger and lets in more light. That can be confusing, but I want you to remember, the smaller the number, the bigger the hole. As we work from left to right, top to bottom, one stop at a time, because from a 1.4 to a 2.0, that's what we call a stop or a full stop when we're talking about aperture. And when we go from a 1.4 to a 2.0, the aperture hole gets smaller, and because of that, lets in less light. And as you can see, if we go from a 2.0 to a 2.8, the hole gets smaller and lets in less light. The same as a 4.0 to a 5.6 and a 5.6 to an 8.0. So the main key to remember is all the way back to the first one on top, the f1.4. When you're shooting at a low aperture, that means the hole is wider. And when the hole is wider, more light gets in. Now go ahead and let that sink in. Now let's talk about the term wide open for a moment, because sometimes when you're talking to another photographer and they say, oh, I love to shoot wide open, and when you look at them with a puzzled look on your face and you're thinking like, I don't even know what that means. Well, what that means and depends on is what lens you are using, because each lens is going to have a different aperture capability. For example, let's say you're shooting with the 18 to 55 millimeter lens that came in the bag that you checked out from the library. If this is the lens that you have and you're shooting with, that means that the widest aperture that you can push that lens to is a 4.5. That's the hole is going to open, and that's the widest it will go. So when you're shooting with the 18 to 55 millimeter lens, you are shooting with the aperture of 4.5. So that means you are shooting wide open with that lens. If you are shooting with a 50 millimeter lens, that means the widest aperture you can push that lens to, and let's say it's a 1.8, the widest aperture you can push that lens is a 1.8. That's the biggest the hole will open to, and that's the widest it will go. That means you're shooting wide open with that lens. So now you know when you talk to another photographer and another photographer says to you, I shoot wide open, now you know what that means, and that it depends on what lens you are using. Whether it be, you know, a 1.2 or a 1.4 or a 3.2 or a 4.5. It's whatever you're shooting with that is wide open. Another great example I like to use are these photos. This is Boo on the left-hand side. He was rescued a few months ago from the Arizona Humane Society by one of my coworkers. And if we look at his eyeballs, his pupils, I want you to look at them and pay attention and notice that they are wide open. He is in a dark room and he's trying to let in a lot of light. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll notice that the pupils are very tiny. They're little slits. They're like those little pinpricks. That's because he's in front of an open window and he doesn't need a whole lot of light to come in. So if we're talking aperture, the picture on the right, on the left, I would say that is a wide open aperture versus the picture on the right, which is a smaller aperture. I would say that would be, let's just, for example, an 8.0. Excuse me. If you are in a place where it's not a lot of light coming in, and the best thing that you can do in that situation is shoot wide open. So push that lens as wide as it'll go. Then you are probably thinking also, it's like, okay, well, if I'm in a low light situation, then should I shoot with a higher aperture when there's a lot of light? And that seems like it would make sense, but I want you to remember that there are two things that aperture does. It doesn't just determine how much light hits a sensor, it also determines how much of the shot is in focus. All right, so let's take a look at this photo here. I want you to look at the book in the front, Fairy in Waiting, and then I want you to look at the book in the back, the purple book, which is Diary of a Wimpy Kid. That's a little soft, it's kind of blurry, as well as the books in the back on the shelf. So this is shooting at a 4.5. I'm gonna go ahead and change it. It's getting a little bit better. We can see a little bit more of the Captain Awesome book, which is on the right. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is still a little soft, but the word diary is getting a little bit more clear, as well as the shelves in the books in the back. So this is shooting at a 5.6. And then our next one is a 7.1. And then you'll notice that it starts to clear up and everything starts to become in focus. So this one is, we are shooting at a f11. And there's an f29. All right, now let's talk about depth of field. When we are shooting a group of people, we want to make sure everyone in the photo is in focus. And this means that we are shooting at an aperture of f6 or f11, meaning that the hole is smaller so that more of the image is in focus. Now, there's quite a few things that we need to affect the depth of field, but we are sticking to aperture and how it affects the depth of field. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next slide. By looking at this image, hopefully it will help you grasp how aperture affects the depth of field. Now remember, the depth of field is how much of the image and what parts of the image are in focus. By looking at this slide, you will notice that the photographer is focused on the lady with the briefcase. His focal point in the camera is on her eyeball that is closest to the camera. And when he does that, everything along that same blue line, also called the focal plane, is going to be in focus. Now, the way that aperture affects the depth of field, and the depth moving in this case backwards in the frame, and assuming that the photographer is shooting at a 2.8, so shooting pretty wide open, so the wider the aperture means the less depth of field you're going to have. Let me say that again. If the photographer is shooting at a 2.8, That's the widest the hole can open to. You're going to be shooting wide open. That means only the subject is going to be in focus. Everything behind her is going to fall out of focus. It's going to be soft and or blurry. So the guy standing behind her and to the left is going to start looking a little soft in the photo, and he's not going to be as sharp as she is. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other examples. So if you notice here, you'll notice that the green crayon is in sharp focus. I am shooting at a 1.8. And then we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And here we go. You'll start to notice that, that red and that blue crayon behind the green crayon is starting to get in more focus. And again, the yellow crayon is starting to become a lot more clear. This is shooting at a 5.6. And here we go at an 8.0. And you can see that a lot of the crayons up front are in focus. This is shooting at an F11. You can also notice the shelves in the background. They're not as blurry. Here we go, it's F18. All the crayons are in sharp focus. That very last one, that purple one, might be a little soft. And here we are shooting at an F22. When you're shooting at an aperture of F22, even more is going to be in focus, as you can see, and the crayons, the ruler, the table, and the shelving unit in the background. Now let's go ahead and take a look and see if you can notice the difference. Do you see the difference? The image on the left, I was shooting at a 1.8, so my aperture was wide open. The image on the right, I closed it up. I was shooting at a F22, so I can make sure that everything in that shot was in focus. So, do you see the difference? Now, just to recap, when it comes to aperture, aperture affects two things. Aperture affects the size of the hole, which determines how much light hits the sensor, and it also determines how much of the image is in focus. So let's go ahead and grab our cameras and an object so that you can practice with, and let's go ahead and play with some buttons. So now you have your cameras, go ahead and flip that switch to on. If you're not on M, manual mode, go ahead and change that mode dial to M. There are two ways to set the aperture. You can press your Q button and toggle over. It's already on, it's highlighted, the aperture is already highlighted. So you can press the Q button, it is highlighted. You can go ahead and change that mode dial. Or you can change the aperture using this button right up here, the one with the blue trash can. You can hit it and it's going to already highlight it. And then you can change it by selecting this button and changing your main dial. So this aperture, this lens that I'm using has a wide open aperture to 1.8, and it can go all the way up to an F22. All right, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to set it to a 1.8, and let's see what our picture looks like, okay? Take a picture. So it's a little bright, but it's okay. Our subject is in focus, so it's the sign. But what I want you to see is look at the shirts in the background. They are soft and blurry. So I wanted my subject sharp focus, but I wanted the background to be soft and blurry. And if I zoom out, you'll also, you'll also notice that the shelving unit, the books, are soft and blurry. So now what if I want to bring those shirts in a little bit more focus? I don't want them to be as blurry, so I'm going to go ahead and change my aperture. And I'm going to hit, let's try a 4.0. So let's bring that up by hitting my playback button. it's not as bright, it's because I am closing that, that lens up. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. My subject is in sharp focus. The shirts are not as blurry as well as the books in the background, but they are a little soft. Okay, so what if there were more people, say that this was a lot of people, so I need those people in the background to be in sharp focus. So I'm going to turn that aperture up. Let's move it to a 7.1 and let's take that picture. All right, let's take a look. Play back. Zoom in. My subject is still in focus. That's where my focal point is at. Zoom in. You'll notice that the two shirts are in sharp focus. So you can start with, if you want your subject to be in focus and you want a blurry background, you're going to go down, or you're going to open it up to the widest aperture, which was, I was using a 1.8. If you're using, if there's a lot of people or a lot of background that you want it to be in focus, then you're going to want to make sure that you close that aperture so that it's in focus. So you're going to bring that aperture up. All right, go ahead and try it.